So in the last lecture, I introduced if statements. You create if statements by writing if and then between parentheses your condition. Now, whenever this condition here is met, you make it into this body of the if statement, which is found between these curly braces. And just as after all such body statements with curly braces, you don't have a semicolon there. Now, what goes between these parentheses, though? Now, as I said, a condition. But to be very precise, what goes between there is actually an expression that resolves to true or false. And that's a specific type in Dart. And this type exists in many programming languages. It's called a Boolean. So here, for example, we have a new variable. Let's say we're tracking the logged in status of our user. And that could be set to true or to false, and that would be a Boolean. A Boolean is a value which is either true or false. There is no other possible value. So true or false, and of course this is a very handy type of value, a very handy data type, because often in programming you have these two options. And you especially need Booleans in conjunction with if statements, because here you in the end want to find out if some condition is true, then do this, or if some condition is false, then don't do that, but maybe, and that's also something you have on an if condition, maybe you then do something else. So that would be your else block here, which you can also specify on an if condition to have an alternative if this is not met. You don't need to have an else block though. It's totally fine if you just have the if block, then you might execute this code or do nothing if this condition is not met, or, well, if you have an else block, then you have an alternative code to run. So both is possible, and Booleans are the key to that. Now, the condition here typically is one of two things. Either you're referring to a Boolean here, so to a variable that holds a Boolean, and then somewhere in your code, you probably have a way of setting this dynamically, because of course, this code snippet here right now doesn't make a lot of sense because is logged in is hard-coded to be false, hence you can never make it into this block, you would always go into the else block. But if is logged in is controlled somewhere else in your code, if it is set dynamically based on some user input or some other action that is occurring, then this here is a typical check. Now what I'm doing here, by the way, is a shortcut to equals true. I'm comparing if is logged in, so the value stored in this variable is true. That's the default check that is performed if you omit the double equal signs. So this here, if is logged in, which can be read as if true, is equal to this check. So it's redundant to check for equality to true because that's the default if you just refer to a variable or to some expression. Now, as I mentioned, this is one of two common scenarios that you have some variable or maybe also some function call where you call some other function which returns true or false. So that you check something that yields true or false here, and that something is a variable or a function call. The other common scenario is that you write a condition here where you directly compare two or more values. Let's say we have the username, that's Max, and I have my age, 30. And I want to make sure that we execute some code here, logged in, when the username is equal to Max. Let's also add a password to make this a bit more realistic. Tester. So here, when my username and my password are correct, I want to print this. Otherwise, I want to take my user or the code execution into the else block and print failed. Now, in such a case, we want to check the values of username and password. And we therefore have no single variable that is true or false, but we want to check if username has a certain value and password has a certain value. In such a scenario, you can check if username is equal to Max, and that's something new which you haven't seen before, the double ampersand sign here means that you also need some other condition to be true. And here you check if password is equal to tester, for example. So in this scenario, what I'm doing is I'm checking two conditions and both have to be true to make it into this if block. If at least one of them is false, even if the other one is true, you make it into the else block here. So now if we run this code, we therefore see logged in because username is Max, I'm setting it here, and password is tester, I'm setting it here. Please be aware that double equal sign has a totally different meaning than a single equal sign. You use a single equal sign here to store a value in the variable. you use a double equal sign here to compare a variable's value with another value. And that is something totally different. Such a comparison, where you use such a Boolean comparison operator, as it's called, always yields a Boolean. So this here yields true or false, and that's where we're back to this Boolean value up there. And of course, you could also use some helper variable like has correct credentials or whatever you want to use here, where you put this check in like this. This is a valid code. And then down there, you only use that variable in the if condition to have a leaner if condition. This is totally valid. Now I'm basically using this Boolean operation here with my comparison and my concatenation of conditions to derive a Boolean value, which is true if both conditions are met, or false if at least one fails. And therefore I store true or false in has correct credentials. And then I'm using has correct credentials down there, which is true or false. So that's all possible, but I'd say the more common case is that you don't use such helper variables, but that you put your condition right into your if statement here. Now, sometimes you also have alternative conditions. Here, both have to be met, but let's say, for whatever reason, we also want to lock the user in if he's older than 20. So we can also add a OR statement with the two pipe symbols here. So here we can add OR and check OR age greater 20. And that's another Boolean comparison operator here. Besides the double equal sign, you also have greater than or equal, smaller than or equal, and also not equal with the exclamation mark in front of the equal sign. Please note that this is only one equal sign in here. So these are alternative operators, and here I'm using the greater than operator so that this part here returns true if age is greater than 20, which it here of course is. Now, how can we read this overall expression though? Well, let's see what happens if I now change my password so that it's wrong, so that this first part here shouldn't be met. If I now run this, we're still logged in. So how can this be read? Well, this reads as, please log me in if this is true and this is true, or if this is true. And well, this here is not true, and therefore this combination here is not true. But this here, this is true. And since it's a or, this overrules the prior false, which this returns. Because we have an alternative condition that could be met. And only if this condition and this condition would be false, we would not make it in here, because then neither of our two or conditions would be true. And of course, it's always a great idea that you simply play around with Dartpad here and with if statements to find out how you can configure that and what you can do there and how the different operators behave. Sometimes you also want to combine conditions differently than they're parsed by default. So instead of maybe saying this and this should be true, you might also want to say, well, this should always be true, and then this here should also yield true. So you want to combine this check. So you want to say, yeah, you're logged in if the username is Max, and then if either the password is tester or the age is greater than 20. Right now this reads as, you're logged in if this is true and this is true, or if this is true. So if you would want to combine password check and age check together, you could also use parentheses in there, just like in mathematical equations. And now you're saying, well, these two conditions here at the end belong together. So now the username always has to be Max. And then you're either having the right password or the right age. So at the moment, that means we're logged in because the username is Max. But now if I change Max up here to Maximilian, we would actually see that when I run this again, we're failing, because this always needs to be true. I'm then combining it with the check of the ladder condition here. Now, if I would, for example, remove these parentheses which I just added, you see that now I would actually be logged in, and that's making a difference. I would be logged in now because I'm checking, is this true and this true, or is this true? And neither of these first two checks is true, but this here is, and therefore that's why we're now logged in. So using these parentheses correctly is very important. And of course, it's also important that you use these comparison operators correctly. Also be aware of the not equal operator, which is also super important. And therefore you have a lot of power to control when your code executes. Now, sometimes you also have a more complex if check, where you don't just have an if and an else statement, but you know, well, if this here fails, I might have some alternative code to execute, but that code also depends on some condition. And then you can add an else if statement. You can then also still have a normal else statement if you want to. Now you would say, well, if this here is not met, if this first condition is not met, then we make it to the next block in line, and that is a else if statement. And there I can check yet another condition. And only if this condition is then also not met, we make it into this else block. If this condition here is met, we don't make it into this else block. And here we could check if is logged in is true. And now if I also add this extra parenthesis pair up there again, so that the first check will fail, now we should make it into the else if block, and then we could print overruled here to see that this executed. But when I hit run here, you indeed see failed, because of course is logged in is false. As soon as we set this to true, however, or we derive this dynamically and it yields true, then we see overruled, because now we're running the else if block, because the first condition was not met. Therefore we got into here, we check this, and this is true, and therefore now we're running this. We're then not making it into the else block too. These are if statements, and they're an important construct in basically any programming language you can learn, and therefore also in Dart. We'll use them a lot throughout the course, and I hope that this lecture here was helpful in understanding how they work and how you may play around with them.